Welcome back to Fabulous Creations. I'm Ron, and this video will be the second video in the series as I work to convert my garage into my dream shop. In this particular video, we'll go over the electric subpanel I had installed in here. Now this work was completed back in the fall, but this intro is being recorded in December, and I don't have heat in here yet, so if you see my breath while I'm talking, that's why. So let's step back to September, back before Minnesota temperatures had dipped to near zero and we got a foot of snow on the ground. As an aside, editing this video really had me longing for green grass and flip-flop weather. Let's jump in. We live in Minneapolis, and almost all houses here have detached garages with alley access. Our house is no different. We had power out in our garage, which isn't always the case with detached garages, but unfortunately it was a single 15 amp circuit from the house via direct burial wire. That's enough for some lights and the garage door opener, but not much else. In order to run lights, dust collection, heat or air conditioning, and a tool like the table saw all at the same time, I figured I would need at least 60 amps available, and more certainly wouldn't hurt. I'll get to more of the why here soon, but the too long didn't read version is we had to dig a trench across our backyard. Before we started digging, we turned off the water line to our sprinkler system in case we accidentally hit one of the lines with a shovel. Because if you're looking for a way to make digging a trench any less fun, hitting a water line with a shovel has to be towards the top of that list. So why did we need to dig a trench? In my search to hire an electrician, I got many opinions and options as to the various ways I could get power I needed to the garage. There were basically three options. One, have a second electrical meter installed in the garage, completely separate from the house. Two, run electric overhead from a pole mounted on the house to a pole mounted on the garage. And three, dig a trench to run all necessary electrical wire underground in conduit. In weighing these options, the first one, having a separate meter installed from the alley to the garage, originally sounded the most appealing. For one, it would involve no digging on our part, and two, it would make accounting easy from a home business perspective, as my business could simply pay the separate electrical bill from business income. But in talking to the electrician that I would eventually hire, he pointed out that having all new electrical service installed from the electric pole in the alley can take months to get approved by the electrical board at the utility company. I didn't have months. I wanted this done before winter. Additionally, the thought had crossed my mind that future buyers of our house might not love the idea of paying two electrical bills just to have electricity in the garage, so it could affect our resale value going with that approach. On that same note, it was sounding more and more like a separate meter would have to be mounted on the yard side of the garage, and I did not want that eyesore there. The second option was a hard pass for me as soon as I heard it. I hate overhead wires, and after seeing how thick the wires were that would eventually be used, it would have been more of an eyesore than the electric meter in option 1 would have been. So we were left with the third option, dig a trench and have all new lines run underground. Easy peasy, right? Before I go any further, if you haven't noticed, I didn't do most of the digging myself. Huge shout out to my workhorse hubby who excels at this type of yard work. You tell him what needs to be done and he just does it, with minimal complaining, and as long as you bring him a Manhattan and a sippy cup every few hours, he's a happy camper. He's a southern boy, born and bred, so I guess there's something to say about that southern work ethic. After the trench was all dug, it was time for Steven over at Atlantic Electric here in the Twin Cities to come and do his magic. I ended up hiring Steven as he was the one who gave me the additional insight about the faults with the other options I said previously. What I appreciated was that he did this in a very respectful way without criticizing the other electricians who had bidded out the job. Additionally, he and I had brainstormed ways to avoid needing to dig underneath our sidewalk and came up with a winning plan of attack together, so that also made me want to work with him. Steven started his work early in the morning the next day, around 8 a.m. I of course wanted to stay out of his way, but I also find this type of work fascinating, so you'll see me hanging around a lot to ask questions and learn from Steven. There was a point early on in this project that I was momentarily contemplating the logistics of doing this work myself, as I know how to do basic wiring of switches, outlets, lights, breakers, etc., but this was completely out of my wheelhouse. For something of this scale, it was a no-brainer to hire a professional like Steven. Steven started out by removing the drywall above the main house electrical panel to install the new wire that would lead out to the garage. Luckily, this was fairly accessible from the service side of the house, so after drilling a hole on the outside of the house, he was able to feed a length of wire down the hole to the panel. I forget the name he used to refer to this type of wire, but it's basically like Romex on steroids. Super thick gauge with 3 conductors and a ground wire. After the junction box was mounted, he started mounting the conduit that would run along the side of the house. This is something that I might otherwise consider ugly, but like I said, this was the service side of the house, and there were already a handful of things like this, so it wasn't much of an additional eyesore. While Steven was doing that, I drilled a hole in our fence post for the conduit to run through into the backyard. I didn't have a Forstner bit, so I had to drill a little bit with a hole saw and then chisel out the chunks before doing a little more until the hole was entirely cut. After we were in the backyard, it was time for my favorite part of our plan, the part that avoided digging underneath the sidewalk. Here, Steven used an elbow connector to slope the conduit downwards closer to ground level, where a length of conduit could run underneath our back steps before making its final 2-foot descent into the ground. The rest was mostly a straight shot right to the garage along the length of our trench. Once inside the garage, Steven could mount the new subpanel and connect the rest of the conduit up to meet it. Next, he ran 2 grounding rods along the side of the garage and connected these to meet the panel. After that, it was time to pull the wire through the conduit. These wires were thick, and there's 4 of them, 2 hots, a neutral, and a ground. Steven taped them all together in a staggered fashion before feeding them through one of the junction box openings. I was on the other end of the yard, helping pull the wires through like a kid eager to help his dad. Once all the wires were pulled into the garage, Steven could make the final connections to the new subpanel. Before making the final connections to the house's panel, Steven connected the 2 different types of wire together at the first junction box, the aluminum wire that entered the house initially, and the copper wire that ran the majority of the run. He used these special wire connectors along with a chemical paste that prevents the aluminum and copper from reacting with each other over time. After these joints were made, he insulated them well and sealed up the box. On the other side of the exterior wall and 1 floor down, Steven wrapped up the work by connecting the new subpanel circuit to the main house panel with a 100 amp breaker. And that was that. After a quick check-in by the city's electrical inspector a few days later to sign off on the work, it was time for us, the Manhattan-loving workhorse hubby, to fill in the trench with all the dirt that somehow fit that space to begin with. We didn't put down any grass seed as this was late fall and figured it would be easiest to repair come spring. So that's where this video is going to end. As I alluded to earlier, I plan to do the rest of the electrical work out here myself, so Steven's work was the crucial first step in order for me to do that. Words cannot describe how happy I was with Steven's work, so if you're in the Twin Cities and need some electrical work done that you don't feel comfortable doing yourself, be sure to give him a call. I can't recommend him enough. Now I've already started installing a few of the circuits that I plan to put out here, and that will be the topic of the next video in this series. That said, I plan to release another project video or 2 between this video and that video as to mix it up a bit. So stay tuned for both of those, and until next time, cheers.